Let's keep talking about the cognitive approach in mini lecture number 2, where we're going to talk about how do we measure personality in the cognitive approach, and I'm going to add some research that's not in the book on how do we use this to understand the self. Okay, if you took the personality test that I made available on Canvas, it was on cognitive complexity, which I introduced in the first mini lecture. I just wanted to follow up on a little bit of research on how do we use that in studies to understand things about people's personality. One thing that you could discuss in terms of personality is different college majors and how people in those majors might differ in terms of personality. And from this table, what you can see is that when we measure cognitive complexity using that same scale that I gave you on Canvas, we can see that people who are psychology majors get higher scores in this scale compared to natural science majors, so like biology majors. And this doesn't mean that psychology majors are smarter or not as smart as biology majors. It's just showing a difference in how do they think about the world. So you saw in that scale that the items are things like, I enjoy thinking about why people do what they do. And of course, if you're a psychology major, I would hope that you're interested in the psychology of why people are doing what they do. So this particular trait seems to be higher in some kinds of college students compared to others. And again, it doesn't mean they're more or less intelligent. It's just a different way of thinking about the world. So these kinds of self-report assessments that we've been using all semester could be used in the cognitive approach. They're not what Kelly recommended. Kelly recommended using something that he called the repertory grid technique, which everybody just calls the REP test. So here's how that works. If you want to go ahead and actually do this, I think you'll understand the REP test the best, but if you want to just follow along, I'll explain how it would work. So when people take the REP test, they are asked to look at the list of 10 people on the next slide and write down a name for each of those 10 people. The 10 people you list can't double. So you can't, for example, have someone like your father's name and then also someone who is your best friend. You can't also put your father. It has to be a different person. If you don't have somebody in that role, so for example, you don't have a father, you can put someone in who counts as a father figure to you. So these are the 10 people that are given to someone who's taking the REP test. And so you write down a person's name. So again, you wouldn't want to put like a boss that you like and your father, if you work for your father or something like that. It has to be 10 different people. So if you want to go ahead and take the REP test, which I'll explain a little bit more on the next slide, you would want to pause the lecture here with this screen up and actually write down the names of the people that fulfill these roles for you. So you're welcome to pause right now and actually write down 10 different people, or of course, how am I going to know? So you can just keep going if you don't want to bother doing that. So once somebody writes down their 10 names, what they are then asked to do is go through a series of triads that are given by the researcher or the therapist, and you then have to analyze how 2 of these people are different from the third person. So I might say, think about the people you wrote down for number 3, number 6, and number 7 from the list that you just had. Tell me how 3 and 6 are similar to each other and how they are both different from number 7. Then you do that multiple times in different triads. How are person number 1 and 10 similar to each other, but different from person number 5? So Kelly says, once you look at the ways that people who take the REP test describe the people in their life, the types of constructs that they use will tell us about the person taking the test. This is not supposed to tell us about the people on the list, the 10 people that they chose to write down. It tells us how the person taking the test thinks about the world. So the connections that they make, the way that they would say, okay, person number 1 and number 3 are both physically attractive and person number 7 is not physically attractive. That tells us that the person taking the test uses physical attractiveness as a way to make sense of their world. Someone else who took the test might not use that construct. So the way that they think about the world is theoretically revealed in the rep test. And the test is described a lot more in your book. One variation that's not discussed much in your book is that sometimes researchers or therapists might include yourself on the list of 10 people. And then we can see, how does the person filling out the test think about themselves, right? So you might say, well, I'm similar to 5 in that we're both super attractive, right? So you can see not only what kinds of constructs do they use, but how do they also analyze themselves. Another way you can use the rep test is to create charts of how people seem to be construing the world and look for common patterns. So here's an example. I took this from a different textbook. This isn't in your textbook, but a different textbook talks about the rep test and shows these kinds of grids. So let's say that mom, dad, sister, etc. were on that list of 10 people. And the types of constructs that the person created and then categorized those 10 people were things like pleasant versus unpleasant, trustworthy versus not trustworthy. So we see these semantic differentials again. And what you can see here is that, for example, on that first semantic differential or construct, pleasant versus unpleasant, you see that only 2 people on this list got a P for pleasant. Most of the people on this list got a U for unpleasant. So if you look at the whole grid, you'll notice that the person who took this particular rep test seems to find most people in their life unpleasant. So that's an interesting insight into the person taking the test, is that I generally categorize the people around me as unpleasant. You can also see that they're mostly untrustworthy, cold, intelligent, and dull. So this person who's taken this test doesn't seem to really get a lot of joy out of their social network. And that tells us again about the person who took the test. All right, I want to diverge a little bit from what you saw in the book, because the book mostly uses this term constructs, because that's what George Kelly said and used. Other people have done similar research with similar ideas, but instead of using the word construct, they use the word schemas. And that's actually the more common term from social psychology. So schemas are very similar to constructs. In social psychology, when we talk about a schema, we talk about a structure or a framework for organizing the world. And so essentially, schemas and constructs are kind of interchangeable terms for the purposes of this class. So examples of schemas would be things like, what kinds of food and drink do you expect if you travel to another country? If I go to Mexico, which I do frequently, because I have a friend who owns a beach house in Mexico. So when I go to Mexico, I expect there to be different kinds of food and drink available than, for example, when I went to Turkey. When I went to Turkey, I knew, as an example, that the country in general is a Muslim country, and so it's a lot harder for you to get alcohol. They don't serve it at restaurants and at hotels and stuff like that. So that was kind of a bummer for me, because I like to do the drinky, but it's just an example of how you might have different expectations when you travel. How you describe yourself is a schema, and I'll talk about that in a little bit when we talk about research. That the idea that we create social categories like different races, different religions, and that we have stereotypes for what that means. Those are social schemas. Specifically, we also have schemas for how do we expect certain events to happen. So a funeral versus a wedding, you have different expectations for how those are going to go. What should I wear? What kinds of conversation will there be? What kinds of activity? Is there going to be a dance? Are there going to be a bunch of speeches? So, so you have these schemas or expectations or constructs for how the world is going to work. One specific type of schema that we talk about in social psychology is a script. A script is a specific order of events that we expect to happen in a specific situation. So we have scripts for going to restaurants, And we have specific scripts for what will happen if I go to a fast food restaurant versus a fancy restaurant, right? So as an example, fast food restaurant, I'm gonna stand in a line, I'm gonna order in front of a cashier, I have to pay for my food beforehand, they're gonna give it to me on a tray, right? This is a very different experience than if I go to a fancy restaurant and I'm gonna sit down and they're gonna give me a menu and they're gonna ask me if I want a glass of wine, and I pay after I get my food. So different expectations. So how we can tie this into personality is that if we have these scripts or schemas or constructs about our world, it can cause us anxiety if things that are unexpected happen. The idea is that for most of us, we're pretty healthy, we're pretty flexible, we can accommodate that change. People with personality problems get stuck and they can't deal with unexpected things, and that causes anxiety. So one of the ways that we can apply this to interesting research is we can think about, how do you construe yourself? What are your self schemas? How do you categorize your own personality? So we can do things like include ourselves in the rep test, as I mentioned earlier. But we can also think about how people categorize themselves in terms of their roles in society. So you might think of yourself as a nerd or a geek because you're interested in things that have been classified as geeky in society. Like, so that's, for example, me, right? I like comic books. I like stuff like Dungeons and Dragons, though it's pretty nerdy. I am not going to classify myself as an athlete or as a jock, because number one, I don't understand sports, and number two, I'm terrible at them. I'm really not coordinated at all. I played soccer for a couple of years. I cannot aim. I'm really bad at handling the soccer ball. So I think of myself in this one way and not in this other way. So an interesting theory that's about how do you categorize yourself comes from a guy named Torrey Higgins, and his theory was called self-discrepancy theory. So we talk about this in social psychology if you've taken that class. Torrey Higgins says that we actually have 3 different concepts of the self at any given time. It's not just one. We have the first one is how we usually think of our self-concept, is what he calls our actual self, which is who you actually are right now. Includes your good traits and your bad traits. But you also have an ideal self, which is the person you would like to be, the person to whom you aspire. So what are your goals and dreams? What kind of person would you like to be? And that's not only things like your career or your potential family that you'd like to have, but it's also personality traits that you wish you had, right? So I wish I were more athletic, could be an example. Third one is your ought self. Your ought self is, what do you perceive society wants you to be? So it's sort of the social expectations that you feel are put on you. So this might be from your parents, it might be from your culture, it might be from your religion. And so it's what other people want for you. It's not necessarily the same things that you want for yourself. So your ought self and your ideal self might not match up. So when we think about these 3 different selves and whether they match or not, we can have figures like a Venn diagram where we have the 3 selves, and if they all matched, all you would see is a single circle. They would all overlap. But as they pull apart from each other, we have discrepancy. That's why it's called self-discrepancy theory. So Higgins says that depending on how these pull apart, it will cause you to have different emotional reactions. So for example, he says that if your actual self doesn't match your ideal self, if you're not living up to the type of person you want to be, he says you'll feel dejection, which he means by that shame and depression. He says when your actual self doesn't match your ought self, you feel like you're not living up to other people's expectations. You feel guilt and anxiety. So this is kind of an interesting theory, and you can think about whether you agree with Torrey Higgins' hypotheses. I'm not sure I do personally. I think it's also interesting to think about the discrepancy between your ideal self and your ought self. So if you think society wants one thing for you, but you're like, no, I kind of want to do this other thing, but you think that you might be judged by that because it's not sort of the popular thing to do in society, maybe you're kind of a nonconformist. I think that's actually a really interesting discrepancy, and Higgins doesn't talk much about that. But it's an interesting theory, if nothing else, because it talks about how we have our actual self, our ideal self, and our ought self. And I think that that's an interesting concept. There's a lot of research on how we think about ourselves and what that means. So I'm going to talk about a couple of examples, and most of these are not in the book. So the first one is a study by Mackey in '93. And this was basically talking about gender and self-construal. So the idea is that men, when they're describing themselves, will often use constructs that are about themselves as independent people, as what we would call agentic people. So they're describing their personal interests or their career. In contrast to that, women tend to describe themselves in interdependent constructs. So what that means is that they generally think about themselves in terms of their relationships to other people. So they might say, I'm a sister, I'm a mother, I'm a daughter, or groups in which they are a member. So psychology major, for example. So this interesting gender difference has been replicated in lots of other studies, but it's just one way that our culture might influence how we construe ourselves and even sort of internalize those expectations. So are we really like that because it's a piece of our ought self? Have we been trained by our culture to think about ourselves in certain ways? Another example of a study that's interesting is Clancy and Dollinger in '93. They actually gave people disposable cameras. This is before there were phone cameras. So these were actual kind of like cardboard cameras with film. They asked participants walk around campus and take photos that describe who you are as you see yourself. And then the people brought the cameras back and the film was developed, and they coded the kinds of photos that different kinds of participants took. And one of the interesting results from this study was that men took more photos of themselves standing in front of something, what we would call like a selfie now. Women went out to campus and took photos of themselves with their friends or their classmates or their teachers. So again, we see this kind of difference between independence in men and interdependence or relationship focus with women. So both of these studies kind of think about how self-construals are tied to social traits like gender. Another study that I think is really interesting is focused on how your self-construal might actually change how well you do on a task or how you remember things. So in this study, they again were thinking about gender expectations, and they asked, their hypothesis was that if we give people a task, a memory task, will just changing the title of the task to be something that seems to be masculine or feminine change the participants' memory of the task. So half of the participants were told, these are instructions that you need to remember for how to make a shirt, like sew a shirt. And then half of the participants were asked, think about this task in terms of how to make a workbench with like tools like hammers. So clearly sewing a shirt is more feminine. Using hammers and nails and stuff to make a workbench is a more masculine task. So they randomly assigned participants to each of these conditions. So you have some women getting the female task, some women getting the male task, and the same for the men, right? So you have matched gender versus cross-gender conditions in the study. So to really understand the study, this is a clip of the actual study's directions. Okay, so this is what they're supposed to remember. So at the top of it, you can see that it's either going to say making a workbench for half of the participants or making a shirt for the other half of the participants. And then these are the instructions. So imagine it's necessary that you make your own workbench or shirt, right? So they only see one of those words. You'll have 1.5 minutes to read the following passage, which consists of directions. Please read it carefully, and then there's going to be a memory test. And then the actual instructions are so vague, they could apply to either condition. The procedure is quite simple. First, you rearrange the pieces into different groups. One pile might be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. So you can read this for yourself if you want, but the idea is that the instructions were so vague that they could apply to either of the conditions, the workbench or the shirt. And the results showed that women did better on their memory of the directions when they were told the directions were about how to make a shirt. And men did better on the directions when they were told it's instructions on how to make a workbench. So just imagining that you're going to be good at the task based on the gender of it helps you do better. So I think this is really interesting from a social psychology point of view, because it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If I tell myself I'm going to be bad at this task because I've already made that my self-construal, right? I'm going to be bad at sports. So then if I'm in a sports condition, if I'm in an activity where I'm supposed to be playing sports, I'm probably going to do badly. But that's because I've already told myself I'm bad at this. So I might not try as hard, right? I might not take it as seriously, as opposed to someone who thinks of themselves as an athlete, right? But that doesn't mean that I'm necessarily as bad as I think I am. I've kind of given up, right? And I think that that's what happened in this particular study as well. The men sort of gave up when they thought it was about a sewing task, and the women maybe gave up when they thought it was about a workbench task. And you didn't necessarily have to do that. You could have been good at that. So I think that's an interesting way that we maybe tell ourselves that we have talents or skills that maybe we're actually better at some things than we think we are. Another interesting example of research, and we're almost done with this mini lecture, is the idea that, again, if you think of yourself in a certain way, you'll be better at a task. So an example is that chess masters can really quickly look at a board with all the pieces laid out on the board and immediately memorize the pattern of the pieces. And they can do that with multiple boards, and they can play chess kind of in their heads. And it's because they probably think of themselves as good at chess. So again, we see that kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, but it's also because they have more experience. So they can immediately recognize which is the pawn versus which is the queen versus which is the rook, right? So the idea is that how you view yourself can help or hurt how well you do at a given task. The last little piece of research that I think is interesting is if you remind yourself of the type of person you would like to be, you are more likely to act in a way that fits that. An example of this is if you put people in a room with a mirror and then you give them the opportunity to cheat on a test, they're less likely to cheat if they see that mirror as opposed to a condition where there's no mirror. And the researchers who did this study said the mirror reminds you of who you are and the type of person you'd like to be. So it makes you feel more guilty, basically, if you cheat, because you have to look at yourself. So I think that this is all really interesting research on the idea of the constructs that we use for ourselves might translate into our talents, how we think about ourselves, what our goals are, and that we don't necessarily have to do those in a way that our culture tells us, but we all tend to do that. So this leads into our final lecture, which is how we can use these ideas in a therapeutic setting to change our personality if we want to. So I'll see you for part 3 soon.